Welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 31. I recently spoke with author Julia Ornelas-Higdon about her book, The Grapes of Conquest, Race, Labor, and the Industrialization of California Wine, 1769 to 1920. Julia is an associate professor of history at Cal State University, Channel Islands. This is a fascinating book if you're interested in the history of California or California wine, especially pre-Prohibition. It looks at this history from a different perspective than what we normally hear about, and one that's kind of hidden from most of the glossy histories. We learn more about the plight of the Native American Indians and the Mexican and Chinese workers that made the early wine industry possible. The large German and French vineyards of Southern California and the professionalization of the industry are covered as well. This book takes a real academic but readable approach, and what I especially enjoyed is that it concentrates more on the early Southern California wine history, which we don't hear as much about. We've discussed some of these topics in episodes 24 and 26 on Professor Eugene Hilgard and the University of California experiment stations, and even more so in episode 28 on the Mission San Jose and Fremont wine history. There are some other upcoming episodes that explore related themes also that I think you'll enjoy. Okay, here we go. Well, I wanted to start out by saying I really love the book, and I thought it was really readable and super interesting. And for me, I liked how kind of concentrated a little bit more on the Southern California wine industry, which I personally, I know some, but I don't know as much about it as I do the Northern California wine industry, especially the real early period down LA, Anaheim area. Mm-hmm. You kind of start at the Mission period, and you start even really before grapes were introduced to California, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that readable. That is the best compliment an academic can hear, that their book is readable. It's interesting you said that you didn't know much about the Southern California part of the wine industry. I didn't either when I started this project. I really thought I was going to write about Napa and Sonoma. But when I started exploring and going into the archives, I was completely blown away to discover that the wine industry did not come out of, Napa or Sonoma, that its origins were in Southern California. And even further back, they weren't commercial in its inception. The industry was something that was born out of the project of conquest and colonization that was the Spanish mission system. And you're absolutely right. I start the book talking about native Californians, California natives. And I do that, not because I'm a specialist in that area of history. I'm not a specialist in native history per se, but I felt it was important, if I was going to be talking about land use and talking about changing populations, to start with the groups that were here originally. So that meant, looking at different communities of California natives in Southern California, looking at how they use the land, what kind of agriculture they use, a little bit about trade networks, et cetera, et cetera.
So once the missions start, obviously the way of life changes awfully quick for most of the native population, and most of the time for the worse. What are some of those ways, as agriculture came with the Spanish, that life changed?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest ways is, and I could talk for hours on this, but one of the most challenging aspects for California natives was, of course, the introduction of foreign plants, foreign animals, and foreign diseases that they had not been accustomed to. And I bring up those three items because they caused changes in how they sustained themselves. The introduction of foreign plants and animals caused disruptions in local ecosystems that affected food supplies. And of course, as we all know, the introduction of diseases just absolutely devastated native communities that were in the coastal areas, which is where the Spanish first arrived. So, as natives around San Diego, around what is we know know as San Diego, I should say, or around what we now consider Orange County, as their populations were affected by this, they were in a really vulnerable place. And many turned to the missions because it was a place where they could get food, right? And of course, they were also the target of Spanish colonization. So many were encouraged or forced to live on the missions. And that's really where wine comes in.
Yeah, one of the lines that really sort of stuck with me was you mentioned the Indian population. They're kind of manufacturers of tools of their own colonization in being forced to work in the vineyards and produce wine. That was a pretty powerful thought. That line really stuck with me. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So why wine? I have to backtrack a little bit and talk about why wine was so important, right? And if food supplies were short in the early 1770s, and if just to give your reader or your listeners a little timeline, the Spanish arrive in 1769 and they begin establishing the missions. And immediately they begin planting food. And that's urgent because, they needed to, lay down their crops. Otherwise, they would be relying on irregular supply ships coming from Mexico. So the Spanish brought with them from Baja California to Alta California, what we now consider our fine state, mission Indians from Baja California to teach and train local Indians on how to plant wheat, for example, or barley. So this was urgent. They had to feed people. You're not going to be able to colonize and convert folks who are starving. But alongside the urgency to plant beans, legumes, wheat, was this urgency to plant grapes because they needed wine for the mass to demonstrate transubstantiation to the mission Indians, i.e., the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. This was a tenet of Christianity. So as part of the catechism, they needed that wine for the mass. So as soon as food was planted, they began laying down, clearing land for vineyards, planting grapevines, and building wine cellars and fermenting that grape into wine. Again, because it was so crucial to the process of conquest and colonization. But of course, the Franciscan friars were not doing the labor themselves. There weren't that many of them. And they needed the natives, the folks who were literally the targets of their conversion, to do the work, the hard manual labor of clearing land, planting grapevines, tending that, pruning, harvesting, crushing, overseeing all of the process.
Is that something you see with colonialism in general or Spanish colonialism in other locations also?
Yeah.
Trademark of them?
Yes. Well, I would say yes in the Americas for sure. The Spanish mostly sent over men, soldiers, and priests. So they really relied on local populations, the people they were conquering and colonizing, to do the work of building churches, of building colonial buildings, homes, infrastructure, all of that.
And that sacramental wine, you said, it's integral to converting the tribes to neophytes and Hispanicize them, basically. But they weren't allowed the wine at any other times, right? It was all purely for the
Mhm.
sacramental purposes.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. So, in addition to being a tool to conquer and colonize California natives, wine was also used as something to differentiate populations in Alta California and to designate power and privilege and one's space on or place on the social and racial hierarchy in Alta California. So California natives were strictly prohibited under Spanish colonial law from freely enjoying the literal, what I call in the book, the literal fruits of their labor. They could not do so legally. Now, that's not to say that they didn't. They certainly challenged Spanish power and drank covertly, sometimes even, stole grapes or planted their own grapevines to covertly make their own product.
I think there's a story in the book about them using a hollow reed or stick
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to sort of siphon out some wine. With the secularization of the missions, how did that kind of open up and sort of kickstart, I guess, the California wine industry in your eyes?
Yeah, so what happened is in the 1820s, early 1820s, Mexico gained its independence from Spain. This was a huge deal. It was now an independent republic. And in establishing the missions, the Spanish government had always intended for the land that the missions owned to be held, kind of like in a trust, what we would consider a trust, and then eventually be reverted back to California Indians. Well, that never happened. In the 1830s, about 10 years after Mexican independence, the government of Alta California took mission lands that should have been given to California natives and broke them up into ranches, these huge, huge ranches, some of them hundreds of thousands of acres. And that land was given or sold very cheaply to colonists, with people who called themselves Californios. So up in Northern California, the most famous one that we think of is Mariano Vallejo, right? Who owned land that extended from his home, which is now in the Central Plaza of Sonoma. I mean, all the way down to the Carquinez Strait, up into Marin County. I mean, it was just a staggering amount of land. So these Californios mostly ranched cattle. There was no way they could cultivate all of the land that they owned, let alone fence it and protect it from wandering cattle. But some of them did farm, and one of the crops they turned to were grapes. And as they began expanding vineyard acreage, they also began selling wine. And this is the first time that the wine industry was commercialized because under the Spanish Empire, it was illegal really to trade with anyone who wasn't Spanish. But the Mexican government liberalized its trade laws and opened its ports for trade. So for the first time, people living in Alta California could freely trade with American and European traders and sell their goods. So there was a market, a small market, but this is the first time we see it being sold openly and legally.
I wanted to jump back real quick because there was something I wanted to mention that you wrote that I thought was also real powerful, where with Father Jose Maria de Zalvadia, where he kind of criticized the so-called gente de razón as kind of idle and that they wouldn't plow their fields, but the Padres weren't really doing that either. I thought that was an interesting. It was kind of like the Thomas Jefferson slavery quotes that you hear
Mm-hmm,
a little
mm-hmm,
bit,
mm-hmm.
where they're sort of doing the same thing that they are criticizing others for.
Yeah. Absolutely, Matt. Yeah, it was a common critique. And I think it's important to note that there were political tensions there. Most of the Spanish Franciscans, I say Spanish, they had been born in Spain, and
Mhm.
they didn't get along with the gente de razón, as they call them, the people of
Mhm.
reason, this elite ruling class of Californios. Those Californios were born in the New World and were opposed to Spanish imperial rule. So there's a lot of political tensions there, but
Mhm.
absolutely there's some hypocrisy going on in pointing fingers at the Californios, where the Spanish had done the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I sort of forgot about those tensions that existed
Hmm.
between sort of the Californios and the New World born people versus the Spanish, and that was kind of a long-standing tension, I think, right?
Hmm.
So you have these large landowners, and then you have sort of this native population that their previous way of life is destroyed a couple times over. First, the pre-mission life, and then
Hmm.
with the missions gone, that way of life is also gone.
Hmm. Hmm.
What sort of becomes of that generation of the native population as the Californios kind of take
Hmm.
over?
Yeah. So, um, under Mexican rule, I think it's important to zoom out a little bit and highlight that in addition to liberalizing trade laws, the Mexican government opened its borders to immigration. So, this meant that for the first time, the population of Alta California expanded with more European immigrants, Euro Americans from the Eastern United States came. And their numbers grew rapidly, such that they soon outnumbered native Californians. So, this again introduces more disease, more competition for resources. And while this is happening in the 1830s and 1840s, we of course have the Mexican American War, 46 to 48. And this is the war in which the United States conquered and took Mexican land. So at that point, by 1850, California is an American state. So again, that's another benchmark, that and the gold rush of massive, massive immigration from all over the world into California. And this influx of new people absolutely decimates California natives, especially in the far northern parts of the state where they really hadn't
Okay.
had as much contact with the Spanish. Spanish and
Mm.
Californios had really stayed in coastal California, maybe inland a little in Southern California, but they hadn't gone that far north and really established huge ranches up there. Their numbers were smaller in Northern California. The gold rush changed that. And again, we see competition for food and resources and disease, such that by the late 1850s and 1860s, it's really mid to late 19th centuries, the nadir of population figures for California natives. In short, they died in huge numbers.
Mm. Some of those new immigrants coming in, that's when you start to see Venus and Kohler and Frohling and Rose, this kind of real early generation of wine growers coming into the US.
Yeah, absolutely. So these were immigrants, the folks you rattled off, French, German, immigrants who came to California to make it big, right? To find their fortune. And some of them may have come with the intention, not these folks, of, you know, mining for gold. Others found that gold in the wine industry. So these men purchased land that had originally been California ranches and planted vineyards or expanded existing vineyards and really saw or oversaw the wine industry expand its market reach in the 1850s and 1860s.
I thought it was interesting how you kind of highlighted Venus, where he straddled the line. It seemed like he was called Don Venus
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
lot, and sort of straddled
Yeah.
that line between Mexican California and American California.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially the early generation, the first immigrants who came into Mexican California, what you're talking about, Matt, is absolutely correct. They assimilated into Mexican society. That's what it was. One of my favorite examples is Benjamin Davis Wilson. And he comes into Mexican California, marries the daughter of a wealthy elite Californio, converts to Catholicism. And his name in Mexican California records in the primary sources, he's Don Benito Wilson. Of course, after American conquest, he does exactly what you're talking about. His name changes again. He's Benjamin Davis Wilson. So that assimilation works both ways, and they're able to straddle and maneuver Mexican California. And when the politics shift and Mexico is no longer in power, they shift over and emphasize their Americanness.
Viñas and Rose, and they kind of had these large ranchos, or what used to be the ranchos, and they would hire all different types of populations, right? They had Chinese workers come into the picture around this time after the Transcontinental Railroad is finished and people looking for jobs, but they're still hiring Mexican workers. How are the relationships working in that time between the different ethnic groups?
I love that question, Matt, because it really highlights the diversity of workers literally in the vineyards in mid-19th century California. Because as you pointed out, or we've discussed, California natives died off or really suffered. So by the late 1860s, vineyard labor was short. And conveniently, at this point, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, and Chinese immigrant men came off of that looking for work. Vineyard workers hired them in droves, certainly by the 1870s, but they weren't the only people working in the vineyards. They were there interacting with Mexican men. Sometimes we would get Sonoran seasonal workers. Sometimes they would be Yaqui Indians from other parts of the Southwest who would migrate to look for work, to earn cash, to buy weapons, to fight their wars against the United States and Mexico in northern Arizona, in southern Arizona, northern Mexico. So there's a really interesting mishmash of people working there. And I should also mention there were Euro-American men who were themselves immigrants, again, from the eastern U.S., who were newly arrived in California and needed cash wages to work. So all of these folks came together in the vineyards. But what's really interesting is when I looked at the records, for example, accounting books or memoirs left behind, personal records of families, such as Leonard J. Rose's family, who owned Sunny Slope Vineyard, which is in now present-day San Marino, Azusa, that area. The labor and the wages were used to differentiate people by race. So the privileges and the amount that people would earn really varied by their racial group. White men were paid the highest amount of wages. They could often draw their wages whenever they wanted. So this meant that if they felt like being paid on Wednesday for the work they'd done that week, they could draw their wages. In the case of the Rose family, they paid their Mexican workers every week. They would be paid on Saturday afternoon after the workday was concluded, and each worker would go to the boss's house and interact with Leonard J. Rose himself. He would pay them their cash wages as well as a small skein of wine. Chinese workers were paid monthly, and they were on a contract. So this meant that one labor representative would negotiate wages with the landowner for the entire group. And that labor, person would collect the wages once a month and distribute them. And the other difference we see is in housing. A lot of these vineyards were in rural California. Housing was short. So some groups had housing included with their job, usually white men. Chinese men were expected to camp.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, set up camp.
And at this point, we're really seeing very little of the native population working for the vineyard owners.
Yeah, certainly by the late 1860s and 1870s, their numbers were so small that they're not really, if there are native peoples, they're not usually from California. Again, they're from other parts of the Southwest.
Okay. A lot of the Southern California portion of the book you base around Kohler and Frohling and their large winery. Around 1854, they were kind of instrumental in starting Anaheim.
Yeah, that's correct. These were two random German musicians who immigrated to San Francisco and serendipitously decided to start making wine. They had no experience in winemaking.
Okay.
And they were so successful that they wanted to expand their business, but they didn't want to deal with the investment and the upkeep of purchasing and maintaining extra vineyards. So they wanted to do what many winemakers do today, buy ready-made grapes from a vineyardist. Trouble was there wasn't sufficient vineyard acreage in Los Angeles, so there wasn't enough surplus for them to purchase that to expand their winery. So they got together with the German immigrant community in San Francisco and created a wine colony. It was a joint stock company whereby colonists would buy shares and invest in the wine colony, which we now know of as Anaheim, California. And that took a couple of years to get started. Again, like earlier winemakers, they hired racialized workers, Chinese and Mexican and California natives to lay out the town, to clear land for vineyards and do all the hard work of setting up the town and the vineyards. And then they moved south from San Francisco.
Okay.
And began making wine for Kohler and Frohling.
So by this time, everything's a little more mechanized, right? There's kind of a lot of talk about leaving the old mission and Spanish ways behind. Anaheim had a Chinatown, I think you say also, right?
Yes, like many small towns in California at the time, it segregated its Chinese residents. So this was not uncommon for the period. Napa, Sonoma, Marysville, Stockton, they all had Chinatowns. But those residents were so important for the local economies and providing labor.
I thought it was interesting the point you make that a lot of sort of the white European immigrants were able to kind of obtain citizenship quicker going through California than they could have if they were on the East Coast still or east of the Mississippi.
Yeah, such a fascinating thing to look at how time and place are so specific to how racial hierarchies are created. Certainly in the Midwest, for example, Germans were foreign, decidedly foreign, and not quite American at this point in United States history. But in California, it was different. California, as we've talked about, was Spanish, it was Mexican. And in addition to that population, which Americans, were slowly trying to chip away at the power of Mexican Californios, trying to transform it from a Spanish Mexican Catholic place to a white Protestant place. In addition to those tensions, you have to throw in Chinese immigrants. And they were really treated in racist ways. They were denied American citizenship. So with that context, European immigrants were able to juxtapose themselves against those populations of color to assert their whiteness and claim an American identity far sooner than their counterparts in other parts of the United States would have been able to at the time.
Okay. Yeah. Super interesting thought. Just, yeah, how time and place matter so much.
Mm-hmm.
So Frohling and Kohler, they became really successful and even part of the California Wine Association as it started to develop. What are some of the other changes that we see as these larger conglomerates, you kind of move away from small ranches and into more these like corporate entities, a lot of advertising.
Hmm.
It turns into really a business, I guess.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I argue in the book is that historians really need to shift the focus away from citrus as being the origins of commercial agribusiness in California and look at the wine industry. And it's exactly the things you brought up. It's this professionalization of an industry. And the way winemakers do this is, they rely on wage workers, and that's deeply rooted in this industry. Um, they start to emphasize scientific agriculture. And this all coincides with the establishment of the University of California, which had a vibrant College of Agriculture in Berkeley, along with experimental research stations around the state. So that coincides nicely with this. It also dovetailed off of the establishment of trade groups like the California State Agricultural Society is one of the earliest ones. And they lobby for state dollars. They lobby to fund research, to fund prizes for agricultural, accomplishments, and for tax cuts. They're looking for tax cuts. And then finally, advertising, as you mentioned, especially by the late 19th century, in the 1880s, 1890s, as, again, if we zoom out and look at broader American history, this is a time when the temperance movement is really taking off. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union is advocating for the abolition of alcohol. Well, what the wine industry does, especially in California, is they begin promoting their beverage not as something that is dangerous and causes inebriation like whiskey or hard spirits might, but they argue that it's a healthful beverage. It actually prevents drunkenness and actually civilizes the American palate and the American table. So it's really interesting how they use advertising to fight against this growing movement against drinking.
Yeah, you see Sbarbaro from the Italian Swiss colony writing a lot of pamphlets and all the trade papers and then other pamphlets to be distributed about temperance and sort of against the demon rum and beer, but like wine prevents drunkenness.
Yes. Yes, very counterintuitive to us today, but that was the thinking at the time.
At this point, you're seeing California wines really expand their distribution areas. You have stuff going to New York, to New Orleans, I think is a huge market at the time. And they're really trying to break into like South America and Europe, especially. I think they really have a chip on their shoulder about Europe at the time.
Yeah. So a lot of the large winemakers in California, some of the folks we've talked about, Kohler and Froling and Rose, later on the California wine industry, they all set up businesses, offices, physical offices in Chicago, in New York, Boston, New Orleans, the major cities, Washington, the major cities along the Eastern Seaboard, and they really do try to crack the European market. At one point in the late 19th century, they even send California wines to France to be judged alongside French wines, and they performed abysmally in the blind judgments. And, there's writings that I read in the libraries of winemakers complaining that they had been judged unfairly for being American. And if, this had happened outside of France, their wines would have been judged more fairly, et cetera, et cetera. So they did not have as much success in Europe at this point.
I wanted to ask you, this might be stepping back in time a little bit, but sort of the promotion of California as kind of a Mediterranean climate, and they kind of call it, the Italy of the United States. To try to sort of lure more European immigrants over to California?
Yeah, and this really connects to what we were discussing earlier about how many Americans found California to be an unsavory place because of the strong presence of Spanish and Mexican Catholic culture. And they sort of spun it to make it more appealing, to attract more colonists, more settlers to come and Americanize and whiten California. What they do is they spin it as being Mediterranean. They look to the climate. They point to grapes. Grapes and wine are a huge part of this. This push to make California seem less of a dangerous, uncultivated, wild place and make it seem more civilized, more cultivated, more European, and of course, whiter than it actually was.
Mm-hmm. And so we were just talking about the temperance movement, and a lot of the industry heads were really, really worried and concerned about that quite a while before Prohibition came to pass. You see counties and states sort of start to go dry, and there's a lot written about it. And it's kind of it's not quite as cut and dry as I think we're sometimes taught or think of it as. It was sort of a long time coming. They were really worried about it. And it's over the course of like 25 years or more, really, where this temperance movement just keeps building, and they fight against it, and you hit Prohibition, and that's about when the book stops, is kind of at that Prohibition. What are the echoes of that we see today?
Yeah, like the echoes of Prohibition today. Yeah. Well, you're right. It's like actually a 40-year build. We think about it. 1880s to like 1920, if we call it. And it is a gradual build, and the lines are not hard and dry. I mean, we were talking about Anaheim earlier. In the early 20th century, before national prohibition was passed, all of the towns surrounding Anaheim were founded by white Protestant immigrants from the Midwest. So they went dry early.
Okay.
Before it was a national thing. Anaheim was a wet town. So that meant that, oil workers around in other parts of Orange County could go and enjoy their weekend beverages in Anaheim and then go home to their dry towns. Okay. But I would say, it's hard for historians to say what could have happened, right? But we do know that with the passage of Prohibition, it really did affect the wine industry in terms of the production of the finished product. What it didn't affect initially were vineyardists. So people who owned and grew vineyards actually did really well in the 1920s because under Prohibition law, people were permitted to make a small amount of wine for home consumption. So this meant that actually the demand for grapes went up. And up in San Francisco, I know there are a lot of homes built in the 1920s that have wine cellars or like wine vats in the basement, so that, especially in historically Italian neighborhoods, so that people could do their own crush and make their own wine. But in terms of the lasting impact of it today, that's a really interesting question to think about. What or where the wine industry would be if not for Prohibition? Would there have been an earlier Renaissance instead of one that came later after World War II? I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah. And that small amount is actually a pretty, 200 gallons is a pretty substantial.
for home consumption. Yeah, it's not peanuts for sure.
Yeah. How did you get the idea to write the book? How did that come about? Was it a personal story for you, or just something that kind of grabbed your attention and you ran with it?
Yeah. Like so many good ideas, this came over while I was enjoying a bottle of wine. I mentioned to you earlier, Matt, in our private conversation, I'm from Solano County, which is in Northern California in the shadow of Napa and Sonoma. And as a child, I grew up going to wineries. It's what you do if you're from
Hmm.
that area and family are visiting from out of the country or out of state. You take them wine tasting. It's a world-renowned area. So I had that backdrop of knowing about the wine industry. And I went to graduate school at USC in history, knowing that I
Okay.
wanted to study agriculture. My family, my grandfathers, great grandfathers were all braceros. I was
Mm.
interested in that guest worker program and the experience
Hmm.
of workers in agribusiness. So, with those, that personal background, I was in my first year of graduate school trying to decide what to write on for a spring seminar paper. And I was sharing a bottle of wine with my parents at their home. And my mom said, why don't you write about the Chinese? They dug out all of the tunnels in the wine cellars in Napa and Sonoma.
Mm.
And it was one of those, record scratch moments. I was like, wait, what? Having been to countless wineries since well before I could legally drink, plugging my little nose in the wine cellars and never knowing that the Chinese had built those, while also appreciating all they had done in the gold rush and in building the transcontinental railroad. And I wondered, well, why have I never read that before? Let me look. And I started looking and researching and realizing that this wasn't a very well explored area of California history. And I wanted to know why, and brought me to this book many
Okay.
years later.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't ask you about him, although he's probably most well-known person just about in your book. But Agustin Harasti kind of covers a decent chunk of the book, and he's probably one of the more famous people for having Chinese workers dig some of the tunnels and caves
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
at his
mm-hmm,
Buena Vista
mm-hmm,
winery.
mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. He is in the 1850s. He's a Hungarian immigrant with a really shady background.
Hmm.
um, landed in Sonoma, began making wine, and early on he was giving speeches and writing to the California State Agricultural Society, writing articles in local newspapers, encouraging his peers to hire Chinese workers. Because as a capitalist and a grower and a businessman, he pointed out to his peers that Chinese men could be hired for far less than could white men. Their
Okay.
labor was reliable, and they would, live in conditions that most white men would not put up with. So he was encouraging his fellow growers very early on to hire Chinese workers.
Yeah, and him and his son Arpad, their writings really dominate a lot of that period's kind of
Hmm.
correspondence in the wine industry. They were really big names in the
Hmm.
industry at the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm. No, absolutely. And Arpad Harasti, I always like to highlight his connection, his Californio connection. His wife, of course, was the daughter of Mariano Vallejo. He and his
Mhm.
brother married two Vallejo daughters. So even their success is rooted in that connection to elite Californio culture.
Hmm.
That connection there really helps them in a business sense.
I didn't realize. I don't know as much about the other brother.
Yeah, he's not as well known, but they married two Vallejo sisters.
Mhm. Can you tell me a little bit about the cover of the book? It's a real striking illustration.
Yeah. So this piece of cover art was it's a 19th century engraving, and the artist is Paul Frenzini. And the title of the art is The Vintage in California. And what it depicts is the harvest being processed up in Sonoma. And on the cover, you just see what I love about it is it really represents a diverse array of workers. You see Chinese men, lifting bushels of grapes. You see Euro American men processing the grapes through the the crusher and stemmer. So it's really just like a snapshot of the harvest at this point in the late 19th century. And where I got it was from Harper's Weekly. It was published as part of a series in Harper's about the American West in October of 1878. So that's where I found this beautiful image, and it was just so striking to me. I just love that the University of Nebraska chose it to illustrate the book, because it really does get to the heart of what I discuss.
Yeah, real interesting. So many little details in it. I love it. So
Yeah. Well, I think many times historians, we write about the past, and they're fascinating histories, right? We try to understand what happened on this land. How did it change over time? Who was here? Why does it matter? And the why does it matter question is an important one, where many of our people in our contemporary American society will say, well, who cares? Right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important with the history of the wine industry, especially given how significant wine is to California's contemporary society. I think it's important to acknowledge the populations who made this industry possible, who literally planted the seeds of the contemporary wine industry, particularly California natives and Chinese immigrants, as well as German immigrants and Mexicans, to look at the beautiful and rich diversity of the people who made this industry possible. And to acknowledge that, and also look at contemporary vineyard workers and acknowledge them, and realize that, the beautiful Chardonnay that I had for dinner last night, had with my dinner last night, was brought to my kitchen table via the labor of Mexican guest workers up in Sonoma. So to really just pause and, yes, enjoy the beautiful wines and appreciate them, but also look beyond the bottle and look beyond the folks in corporate office at the famed wineries we have all up and down the state, and think about whose labor is making it possible for us to enjoy these wines.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Where can people get the book?
It is available directly for purchase from the University of Nebraska Press, or people can purchase it wherever they buy books. So your favorite local indie or big box store, online retailers, it is everywhere.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Julia today. I learned a lot from this book, and I'm sure most of you will too. Again, it's author Julia Ornelas-Higdon, and the book is The Grapes of Conquest, Race, Labor, and the Industrialization of California Wine, 1769 to 1920. There are links to purchase the book in the show notes, and I think it deserves a place amongst the other wine books on your shelf. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening, and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you feel like supporting the podcast monetarily, to hopefully allow for more episodes, more travel, and to help defray other costs. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.